Imagine being in the most powerful room in America, surrounded by executives, aides, and cameras. Everything's supposed to be scripted, controlled, polished for the cameras. Yet in an instant, everything goes off script. Executives freeze, aides panic, and the illusion of control begins to crack. This isn't about politics. It's about power and focus. It's about a moment inside the White House that left even friendly media searching for an exit. What you're about to hear goes far beyond a single meeting. It starts in the most powerful building on earth, where everyone knows the stakes. Everyone knows the cameras are rolling. They all know the script, yet no one knows what the president will do next. This was not a loud moment of chaos. No, it was far more unsettling. It was a quiet breakdown. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a moment that could have been a controlled, calculated display of power and leadership, but instead it spiraled into something far more awkward. It was Donald Trump sitting across from oil executives, supposed to lead a conversation about international energy deals, yet what unfolded was something else entirely. A slow motion collapse of focus, discipline, and presidential instinct. You could feel it slipping from the start. The rambling praise, the fixation on strength, the repetitive self-congratulations, every sentence bent back toward himself as if governing, diplomacy, and global conflicts were merely props for his ego. This wasn't a campaign rally. There were no cheering crowds filling in the gaps for him. It was a room full of people, officials, executives, cameras, expecting coherence, expecting a leader who could stay on course long enough to deliver a message that mattered. Instead, what they got was a man drifting, improvising, contradicting himself, talking in bizarre military metaphors about armadas and waves, speaking about Venezuela as if it were both conquered and unresolved at the same time, declaring victory while hinting at force, projecting dominance while sounding confused. All of this in front of a room full of people who understood what was at stake financially, politically, and historically. Because this meeting wasn't about patriotism or security. It was about money, power, and access. It was about corporations positioning themselves to profit from geopolitical instability, and Trump soaking in their approval like oxygen, smiling at their praise, basking in their flattery, but slowly losing track of what he was supposed to say. And that's when the first crack appeared, something so subtle yet so revealing. Marco Rubio, seated nearby, did something no cabinet official ever wants to do on camera. He intervened. Quietly, he slid a note toward the president, not as a policy suggestion, not as a strategic adjustment, but as a basic redirection, a reminder to return to the script, to focus, to keep the meeting on track. And Trump's reaction was telling. The confusion, the irritation, the public reading of the note aloud, the need to reassert dominance, even as he revealed he'd lost his place, turning a simple redirection into an uncomfortable spectacle. What should have been a seamless transition turned into something far more awkward. And as the executives tried to get back on track, talking about production numbers and operations on the ground, Trump's attention visibly drifted. His body language restless, his eyes wandering, his mind elsewhere. It's here that the moment crossed from awkward into alarming, because leadership at this level isn't about charisma or bravado. It's about focus. It's about making decisions, understanding consequences, and remaining present, even when the conversation is mundane. Yet here was the President of the United States mentally checked out of a meeting that was dealing with international energy, sanctions, and geopolitical leverage. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, Trump did something utterly astonishing. He stood up mid-meeting, mid-remarks, mid-camera, and decided to wander off. His stated reason? To go look at the ballroom, as if a tour of decor were suddenly more important than the ongoing discussion about oil production, energy markets, and national security. In that instant, the room froze. Aides panicked. Executives exchanged confused glances, and viewers at home were left with their jaws on the floor. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't an aside. This was a president abandoning the meeting he himself had called, right in front of the cameras, for a personal whim. The symbolism couldn't have been clearer. The most powerful man in the world interrupting a serious policy discussion, abandoning his responsibilities to admire a room, a literal hall built and funded by the very interests sitting before him. It was a moment that echoed a dangerous reality. A room full of people, executives with deep ties to energy, finance, and global markets, watching as the president, who was supposed to be leading them, walked away for something as trivial as the appearance of a ballroom. It wasn't just a flippant action. It was an abandonment of duty, a symbol of instability, and the true cost of an erratic leader. As Trump wandered off, marveling at the view, commenting on the space, indulging in self-congratulation about how beautiful it was, the room was left in a state of frozen disbelief. The aides quickly sprang into action, scrambling to restore some semblance of order, but the damage had already been done. What had started as a meeting of global importance, dealing with energy policies and international relations, had turned into a display of erratic behavior that no one in the room could ignore. What's truly alarming about this moment is that it wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. What we witnessed that day was a crystallization of a larger issue that had plagued much of Trump's presidency, a leadership style defined by impulse rather than preparation, ego rather than responsibility, and praise over policy. It wasn't just about one man's need for adoration. It was about the systematic erosion of competence at the highest levels of government. And what made this meeting stand out was the fact that it all happened in full view of the cameras, unfiltered and raw. As the president wandered off to look at the ballroom, the oil executives who had gathered there to discuss energy production, sanctions, and geopolitical issues were left to wonder, what had just happened? They had come to the White House with the expectation of engaging in a serious discussion about the future of energy and international relations. Instead, they were forced to watch as the man they trusted to lead them, the most powerful man in the world, checked out. His attention drifted to something as insignificant as the appearance of a ballroom, while the very issues that could shape global markets and power dynamics went completely unresolved. The worst part? No one in the room could stop him. No one could bring him back to the matter at hand. This wasn't just a slip-up. It wasn't just a moment of forgetfulness. It was a clear and deliberate act of disengagement. It was as if the president, for a moment, had completely abandoned his role. And what made it even more unsettling was the reaction of those around him, people who had spent their careers shaping policies, forging alliances, and making decisions that had real-world consequences. Instead of correcting course, instead of attempting to steer the conversation back to the real issues at hand, they were left to pick up the pieces. As aides rushed to fill the void, Marco Rubio once again stepped in, this time with a more direct intervention. He handed another note to the president, not just to redirect, but to get him back on track. It was a subtle reminder that leadership is about maintaining focus, about staying grounded in the task at hand. But Trump, in his usual fashion, read the note aloud, not only revealing his lack of attention, but his irritation at being reminded to stay focused. This wasn't just awkward, it was a window into a larger problem. The very fabric of governance, which is supposed to be based on reason, discipline, and consistency, was unraveling before the cameras. The most powerful man in the world, sitting at the head of a meeting about energy, sanctions, and international power, was visibly disinterested. His mind had checked out. His body language told the story, restless, distracted, disconnected. The stakes of this meeting couldn't have been clearer. These weren't abstract issues about national security or some far-off political drama. This was about energy markets, global financial systems, and geopolitical leverage. This was about real money, real power, and real consequences. Yet none of it seemed to matter to the president in that moment. The admiration of oil executives, the flattery he was receiving, had become the focus of his attention. The substance of the meeting, where billions of dollars were at stake, where international alliances were being forged or fractured, had taken a back seat. In a room where every word spoken could have ripple effects across the globe, Trump was more interested in the praise he was receiving than the serious decisions being made around him. And as the executives sat in silence, trying to figure out what to do next, the symbolism of what had just happened couldn't be clearer. The meeting, which had begun with the intention of discussing global energy issues, had become a performance one that was designed to validate the president's ego rather than tackle the pressing issues of the day. This wasn't governance. It was a spectacle. And in that moment, Trump had become the star of the show, not as a leader, but as a performer. And yet, even as the meeting continued without him, the damage was already done. The image of the president abandoning the conversation, checking out mentally, and wandering off for a personal whim had already burned itself into the public consciousness. It was a moment that could not be erased, a moment that was visible to everyone, from the aides scrambling to salvage the meeting, to the executives trying to keep things moving, to the viewers at home who were witnessing it all unfold. The message was clear. Leadership wasn't about commanding attention. It was about showing up, staying present, and understanding the consequences of the decisions being made. And in that moment, Trump had failed to do any of those things. As the meeting struggled to regain its footing, the chaotic scene unfolded in front of the cameras. What had begun as a high-stakes policy discussion about energy, oil production, and international relations had devolved into something far more disorienting. The president, the supposed leader, was no longer at the center of it. His aides, his advisors, and even his executives were left scrambling, trying to make sense of the disarray that had unfolded before them. But it wasn't just the disruption in the meeting itself that was alarming. It was the pattern it revealed about leadership at the highest level. What we saw wasn't a single slip-up. It wasn't just an isolated incident of distraction. What had happened in that room was a microcosm of the larger problem that had plagued much of Trump's time in office. The pattern of erratic behavior, the refusal to stay focused, the constant need for praise and validation, all of it had led to this moment. The president had shown that he wasn't just disengaged, he was incapable of staying present when the stakes were high. And in that moment, the consequences of his disengagement were painfully clear. This wasn't just a meeting about energy policy or oil production numbers. This was a meeting about power, about the immense responsibility that comes with leading the most powerful country in the world. And yet, as the president meandered through the halls of the White House, admiring the ballroom, the executives who had come to discuss the future of global energy were left to pick up the pieces. They knew the stakes. They knew how much was riding on this meeting. But it wasn't just about energy contracts or international relations anymore. It was about the future of governance itself. Could a country this powerful continue to function when its leader was so erratic, so disinterested in the details? As Trump wandered off, the aides who had spent years working behind the scenes to manage the president's unpredictability found themselves thrust into damage control mode. Rubio's earlier intervention was a sign of just how far they had gone to keep the meeting on track. But now, they were left to deal with something far worse. A president who had checked out entirely. The scrambling aides, the awkward silences, the forced smiles, they were all part of the machinery working overtime to mask the dysfunction that had suddenly spilled into view. And it wasn't just the aides who were left trying to manage the fallout. The oil executives who were supposed to be discussing matters of great geopolitical importance found themselves in a bizarre situation. They were used to dealing with power, to negotiating with the world's most influential leaders. But now they were left questioning whether they were even being taken seriously. The president, the one person who was supposed to be leading the conversation, had completely lost interest. Instead of addressing the complex issues at hand, he was more interested in the superficial praise he was receiving and the admiration of the room. What's worse, the moment wasn't just uncomfortable, it was revealing. It showed a side of the presidency that most of us don't see. A side that isn't polished for the cameras or scripted for public consumption. This was a side that exposed the underlying dysfunction, the lack of focus, the absence of discipline. And as the executives tried to return to the task at hand, Trump's attention seemed to wander even further. His body language became more restless, his focus even more elusive. It was as though he was physically present, but mentally checked out. The stakes of the meeting, energy markets, international relations, billions of dollars in future investments, were of no apparent interest to him. And this is where things took a darker turn. Leadership is not just about being charismatic or projecting strength. It's about maintaining focus, about being able to sift through the noise and make decisions that will impact millions of lives. And yet, here was the President of the United States in the midst of a crucial meeting about global energy, sanctions, and geopolitics, unable or unwilling to focus on the task at hand. Instead, he was more concerned with admiring the decor, with soaking in the praise, with basking in the flattery that was being directed toward him. And that's when the room hit a new level of discomfort. When the President of the United States abandons a meeting about international energy policy to go look at a ballroom, it's not just a break from protocol. It's a moment that exposes the fundamental issue with leadership at the highest level. The absence of focus, the lack of attention, the seeming disregard for the gravity of the responsibilities that come with the office of the president, it all came crashing down in that one moment as the president wandered off, leaving the meeting behind. The aides and officials were left to pick up the pieces. The executives who had come to discuss serious matters found themselves trying to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded. They tried to resume the conversation, but the damage was already done. The room had been irreparably shaken. The public display of disengagement had shattered any illusion of control. What followed was a forced attempt to get the meeting back on track, but it was clear that the president's absence had left a void that no one could fill. The executives, who had once hoped for a clear, focused discussion on energy and policy, now found themselves left in limbo. They knew that the decisions made in that room could affect global markets, could shape the future of energy production, could influence the balance of power on the world stage. But the man they had come to see, the man who was supposed to be leading them, had checked out. And this was the moment when the spectacle of leadership, the performance of governance, became painfully evident. This wasn't about policy anymore. It wasn't about global strategy. It was about keeping the show running, keeping the cameras rolling, and making sure that the image of power wasn't completely shattered. As the meeting limped forward, the awkwardness of the moment persisted. The energy that had once filled the room had been drained, replaced by a palpable sense of discomfort. Aides tried to regain control, but they were dealing with a problem that was far bigger than one erratic decision. The entire premise of leadership had been thrown into question. What was supposed to be a routine meeting about energy, policy, and geopolitics had transformed into a real-time lesson in instability. What's more, the instability wasn't an isolated moment. It was the core of what was happening in the room. The president had wandered off, abandoning his duties, while everyone around him scrambled to keep things afloat. And as much as the aides tried to smooth things over, there was no ignoring the implications of this moment. The executives who had gathered for this meeting weren't just random people with passing interest in the topic. They were major players, decision makers in the energy industry, people who knew the stakes all too well. For them, the president's actions were more than just an oddity. They were a window into a much larger problem. In their world, focus and strategy were everything. The smallest misstep could lead to billions in losses or gains, shifts in markets that would ripple across economies. And here they were, trying to engage in serious discussions, only to watch as the leader of the free world disengaged. It wasn't just the executives who were left in an uncomfortable position. The aides, too, found themselves in a difficult spot. When a leader checks out in such a public and visible way, the consequences aren't just personal, they're institutional. Aides are supposed to be there to help guide the president, but in this case, they found themselves playing a far more reactive role. Instead of facilitating policy discussions and assisting in decision-making, they were forced to manage a crisis of focus, and the strain on them was visible. You could see the stress in their body language, the forced smiles as they attempted to keep the meeting going, the awkward pauses that punctuated the silence when no one knew what to say next. What made this situation even more revealing was the media's response. Typically, media outlets are eager to capture every moment to showcase the actions of the president, even if they're controversial. But in this case, something extraordinary happened. Fox News, one of the president's most loyal outlets, made a rare decision. They cut away from the live broadcast. It wasn't an editorial choice based on political bias. It was a decision made out of pure necessity. The moment had become too damaging to air uninterrupted. The actions of the president, abandoning the meeting midstream, were so out of bounds, so difficult to defend, that even a network accustomed to smoothing over his excesses couldn't justify it. The cutaway wasn't a moment of political judgment, it was triage. It was an acknowledgement that the optics had shifted from what could be framed as a sign of strength or authenticity into something that was undeniably indefensible. And that's the problem. When leadership becomes a spectacle, what is initially tolerable or even excusable becomes harder and harder to defend, especially when it happens in front of an audience that includes both allies and critics. And that's where the story shifts from an isolated incident to something far more profound. What we witnessed that day wasn't just one president losing focus in the middle of a meeting. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue, a presidency built on impulse rather than discipline, ego rather than responsibility, spectacle rather than substance. The most powerful man in the world had abandoned the meeting because his ego and need for praise had overtaken his ability to focus on the job at hand. And that's where the true consequences of this moment became clear. In the room, there were people who knew exactly what was at stake. They understood the long-term implications of the discussions taking place. But as the president wandered off, distracted by the empty praise, the room became a microcosm of what was happening on a larger scale. Power had been handed over not to those who had the skills or the knowledge, but to those who could flatter, redirect, and gain favor with the president. The executives knew that proximity to power was profitable. They knew that if they played their cards right, they could secure favorable deals, gain access to future opportunities, and profit from geopolitical instability. But they also knew that in this moment, the spectacle of leadership had taken over, and that made the entire process feel transactional. This was the real danger of the moment. The meeting had been stripped of its substance, its seriousness, and its focus. What was supposed to be a discussion about energy policy and geopolitical leverage had been reduced to a performance, with the president at the center of it, soaking in the praise but unable or unwilling to pay attention to the substance of the conversation. And as this dynamic unfolded in real time, it became clear that what we were witnessing was not an anomaly but a pattern of leadership that relied on optics and performance rather than on the actual work of governance. And this is where the behind-the-scenes reality of modern American power became undeniable. These meetings were never meant to be spontaneous. Every word was pre-approved, every transition rehearsed, and every moment calibrated to send a signal. But none of that preparation could save the meeting when the man at the center refused to stay grounded, refused to stick to the script, and ultimately refused to recognize the gravity of the office he held. As the meeting limped to a close, the true consequences of what had transpired began to set in. The executives who had come to the White House with expectations of discussing serious matters, things that could impact the global economy and the future of energy, had been left watching a spectacle unfold in real time. The aides, too, were feeling the weight of what had just happened. They were forced to scramble, to redirect the conversation, to pick up the pieces of a meeting that had veered completely off course. But despite their best efforts, the damage had been done. The image of the president abandoning the meeting, checking out mid-discussion, was already burned into the public consciousness. What made this moment so significant wasn't just the erratic behavior of the president. It was the way that behavior had exposed the underlying dysfunction of his presidency. A presidency that was marked not by careful decision-making, not by a disciplined approach to governance, but by erratic impulses and an overwhelming need for personal validation. In that room, we saw the price of a leader who couldn't or wouldn't stay focused when it mattered most. The real cost wasn't just the loss of attention in that single moment, it was the longer-term erosion of trust in the system. In the presidency itself, this wasn't about partisanship. It wasn't about whether you agreed or disagreed with the policies. It was about the foundational principles of leadership. Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's not about grandstanding or posing for the cameras. It's about staying focused, making decisions with the long-term consequences in mind, and maintaining the discipline to carry out the duties of office, no matter how difficult or unglamorous those duties may be. And that's where the disconnect became impossible to ignore. The office of the president was meant to be a symbol of stability, a bedrock of the American system of governance. But in that moment, it had become a symbol of instability, of unpredictability, and of a leadership style that thrived on chaos. What happened that day wasn't just a momentary lapse. It wasn't an isolated incident that could be brushed aside as an anomaly. It was a reflection of a larger pattern, a pattern that had been on display throughout the president's time in office. It was the pattern of a leader who prioritized praise over substance, who valued personal validation more than the hard work of governance. It was the pattern of a presidency where impulse and ego took precedence over the serious work of leading a country. The executives who had come to the meeting were left to ponder the reality of what had just happened. They had come expecting a conversation about energy markets, international relations, and the geopolitical leverage that could come with controlling energy resources. But instead, they had witnessed something far more unsettling. A leader who had checked out, who had prioritized his own self-interest over the very issues that could shape the world's future. And in that moment, they understood something that many of us hadn't fully grasped before. Governance at its highest levels is not just about policies and decisions. It's about the person making those decisions. It's about the ability to stay present, to stay focused, and to lead with the gravity that the office demands. As the cameras cut away, as the meeting was officially brought to a close, the questions lingered. Questions about fitness, focus, and the ability to manage complexity. Questions that couldn't be answered by a single statement or talking point. And those questions didn't just stop at the doors of the White House. They rippled outward, touching the markets, the media, and the international community. When a president behaves erratically, when he loses focus during critical meetings, it sends a signal. It sends a signal that the leadership of the country is not as stable as it should be. And that uncertainty, that lack of predictability, creates a ripple effect across every sector, every decision-making body, and every institution connected to the presidency. What we saw that day wasn't just a display of weakness, it was a warning about the dangers of unchecked leadership, of a leader who was more concerned with his own image than with the serious work of governance. It was a reminder that the presidency is not a performance. It's a job that requires sustained attention, focus, and discipline. And when those qualities are absent, the entire system begins to unravel. In the aftermath of the meeting, as aides and officials scrambled to restore order, the reality of what had just occurred became clear. This wasn't a one-time slip-up. It wasn't a momentary lapse of focus. It was part of a larger pattern, a pattern that had come to define much of the president's tenure in office. And the cost of that pattern was not just felt in that room, but in the broader impact it had on governance, on the functioning of institutions, and on the public's trust in the office of the president. And as the media outlets debated the optics, as commentators weighed in on the spectacle of it all, the deeper issue remained unresolved. Was this moment a reflection of the larger systemic dysfunction at play? Was this the inevitable outcome of a presidency defined by impulse, ego, and unpredictability? And perhaps most importantly, how much longer could the system continue to absorb this kind of behavior without paying an even greater price?